Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I may not use the entire 60 minutes, but I appreciate the opportunity, and I would encourage other members of the House who are still in town to certainly come over and to seek recognition on this as I try to talk a bit about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and why it is so very important that we, at least here in the House, take a moment or two, or in this case, an hour or less, to reflect on the life, the legacy, and some of even the myths that have circulated over the years. So I'm honored today to rise to really celebrate the birth of civil rights icon and leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, had he lived, would have been 96 years of age yesterday. And to talk a bit about the dream that he tried to put forward in his short 39 years of life, a dream that he felt would be the North Star and the beacon for our country with respect to human rights and human dignity. And as I thought about that and I thought about his dream, I'm reminded of a passage in Scripture, Mr. Speaker, in the book of Genesis, at the 37th chapter, 19th verse, where it says, "And when they saw him from afar, even before he had come near to them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, Behold, the dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him. And we will cast him into some old pit, and we will say that some evil beast has devoured him, and we shall see what becomes of his dream." Well, that dream, despite the bullet of a lone assassin, on April 4th, 1968, did very, very much grow, thrive, and replicate itself as a dream not just for a race of people or group of people, but as a dream for an entire nation. I remember in 1980 as a young member of the Baltimore City Council petitioning the council to join with other local governments around the nation to push for the establishment of a Martin Luther King holiday in our respective towns, cities, and hamlets. For years, every January 15th, I, along with so many others, would drive from Baltimore to Washington to join civil rights leaders and recording artists, people like Gil Scott-Heron, the Last Poets, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, Jesse Jackson, Congressman John Conyers, and thousands of others. And we would rally right here on the steps of this Capitol in the cold in January on the 15th each year, again to petition for the establishment of a King holiday. I, like many others, recognize that in and of itself was a beginning. The real beginning, however, has to go back to the federal legislation that recognizes the King Day as the bill introduced first by Congressman John Conyers of Michigan just days after the assassination of Dr. King. Unfortunately, it would take 15 years of those protests, perseverance, attempts, tenacity, and pure resolve by civil rights leaders and others across this nation for the holiday to become recognized and then finally signed into law by President Ronald Reagan in 1983. And then, unfortunately, it would take an additional 17 years for it to be recognized in all 50 states across the country. And so, fittingly, Martin Luther King Day was designed to intentionally inspire all Americans to volunteer and to give back to their communities. In fact, it is the only federal holiday classified as a national day of service. Like so many others, I feel personally driven out of my respect for the life and legacy of Dr. King to find a way to celebrate this observance through acts of service. For it is only through reflecting the values and the morals and the principles of Dr. King into our lives that we will enact the dream that he has so often been associated with, where justice is the supreme ruler, freedom is the dominant creed, and equity the common practice. And so I would urge us to take a moment in this discussion or any other discussion, a moment of remembrance to really talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the man, the myth, and the legacy. I think it's important to point out that Dr. King was born, as I said before, on January 15th, 1929, in the segregated South in Atlanta, Georgia, where his grandfather began the family's tenure many, many years ago in another state as the pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. After graduating from Morehouse College and Crozer Theological Seminary, Dr. King then enrolled in graduate studies at Boston University. And it was in Boston where Dr. King would meet Coretta Scott, who was also a student at the nearby New England Conservatory. And as we all know, and as history has taught us, the two would ultimately marry, and Coretta Scott would become Coretta Scott King, and together they would be a formidable force in their own right, in their own time, and in joint pursuit of equality and justice for all. So this remarkable partnership between Dr. King and Coretta Scott King also brought forth 4 children who grew up to embrace, uphold, and protect the values that their parents had devoted their lives for. Now, I would be remiss if I did not lift the names of Martin Luther King III, Bernice Albertine King, Yolanda Denise King, and Dexter Scott King, who we unfortunately lost last January. In 1954, as I indicated, their father became the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Dr. King, by this time, was a member of the executive committee of the NAACP and would join also the Montgomery Improvement Association. He would also help to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization that was formed to provide leadership for a growing and sustaining civil rights movement. Dr. King rose to prominence as a revered leader of that movement in 1955, when a young woman, a seamstress by the name of Rosa Parks, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery because of the color of her skin. Inspired by one woman's act of moral courage in the face of an immoral systemic system of law, Dr. King led the Montgomery Bus Boycott that lasted 381 days and is heralded as the catalyst, that one act that began the modern civil rights movement. Now, in order to understand it and to keep it in its proper context, citizens of Montgomery were so outraged that they could pay and were forced, like everyone else, to pay their taxes, that they could contribute to the economy, that they could find a way to sustain families, and that they could find a way, as all citizens did, to support the government there, only to be told that they could not ride a bus to get to work unless they sat in the bus in the back, because of the color of their skin. So it might be difficult to understand, but it is important to point out that those men and women who wanted to maintain and hold on to their dignity decided that they would walk to work, walk to the store, walk to church, as opposed to sitting in the back of that bus any longer. And 381 days is a lot of days and a lot of resolve to get through something like that. It's one thing to see it in a history book. It's another thing if you're living it and you're walking all those miles every day through the summer, winter, fall, and spring, back and forth to do the things that you had to do, like get to your job, the things you needed to do to shop for groceries, and to be able to do anything else. But they did it for 381 days. And they did it because of the inspiration that they got from Rosa Parks, and they did it also because of the inspiration that they got from this young preacher by the name of Martin Luther King, Jr. During that boycott, Dr. King was arrested, his home was bombed, and he was subjected to personal abuse over and over again. Now, he was arrested. No one else that did anything else to stop him was arrested, but he was arrested simply for articulating the problem, supporting the efforts of Ms. Parks, and encouraging a community to stand up and to speak for itself. As I said, his home was bombed. He was subjected to all kinds of insults and personal abuse. And by the way, Dr. King was locked up in jail 29 times for standing up for fairness and fair play. And yet, he never matched the violence he got with violence of his own. On June 5th, 1956, a federal district court ruled that the state of Alabama's segregation policy on public buses was, in fact, unconstitutional. And when the United States Supreme Court upheld that ruling, it was affirmed that the Montgomery Bus Boycott, led by Dr. King as a result of the efforts of Rosa Parks, was a true story of triumph. And it was, in fact, for many, year after year, a focal point on what civil disobedience can look like and what success can be born of it. And so Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would go on to travel for over 6 million miles, speaking over 2,500 times to launch his nonviolent protest movement that spanned the nation. It began to grow and it began to unfurl, and it found its way, reaching and touching the hearts of a lot of people who never even gave a thought about civil rights. But when they thought about their own selves and their own families and their own desire to live and to grow up in the country that many of whom had fought for overseas and defended with their lives, people then realized that this was not just about Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks, but it was, in fact, about the moral consciousness of our nation. After that successful boycott, Dr. King was arrested again, and this time in Birmingham. And it was in Birmingham when he wrote and declared from a cell a number of things that America must, in fact, consider. And he wrote on scraps of paper because they wouldn't even give him writing pads. But he wrote them nonetheless, and those letters are often referred to today as the letters from the Birmingham jail. And in one of those, he fiercely declared that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We hear that repeated over and over and over again. And we should know that those words and that letter from that Birmingham jail cell brought national and international attention to the civil rights movement as we know it. Some of you will recall the grainy film and the black and white footage of the Great March on Washington that occurred on August the 28th, 1963, where the eyes and the ears of the entire world would be fixated on the magnificent power and oratory of Dr. King. I know as a 14-year-old kid, remembering and watching on a very small black and white TV set, the delayed broadcast, because live TV was not what it is today. And I couldn't believe as I sat there the number of people who appeared to be a sea of witnesses that had assembled. Dr. King that day was introduced as the moral leader of our nation and delivered a message which empowered the 250,000 people in attendance. His words that day brought my mother to tears as I sat in a row house in West Baltimore with my 3 younger sisters, all motionless, from the eloquent force in which he delivered a message of love over hate in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Because at that historic march on Washington, more now than a half-century ago, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood before 250,000 people, as I've said, assembled at the memorial of one of our nation's greatest leaders. And on that famous day, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., heir to Abraham Lincoln, addressed the crowd in these words, and I quote, he said, "We have come to our nation's capital to cash a check." And that when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, that they in fact were signing a promissory note to which all Americans would one day fall heir. That note was a promise that all men and women would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, even before the Republic was born, it had already compromised the moral principles articulated in that Declaration of Independence and in that preamble to the Constitution and in all the other pronouncements that it used to justify its revolution against the king's tyranny by having subjected human beings, my own ancestors, to a bondage of the flesh as well as a bondage of the spirit. The enslavement of the Negro, the annexation of the Hispanic, and the termination of the American Indian made our nation's beginning an iniquitous conception because it was born in hypocrisy and dedicated to a false and twisted concept that white men were superior to non-white men and therefore somehow entitled to enslave them, oppress them, and if necessary, destroy them. In the 200 years since the writing of that preamble to the Constitution and that Declaration of Independence, and in all the other pronouncements that America issued to justify, again, its revolution against tyranny, we have surpassed the wildest expectations and aspirations of our founders. We've gone beyond human measure and created a nation of unparalleled power and unparalleled influence. We've grown from a small band of 13 impoverished colonies to become the strongest, the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. Our wealth as a nation is unmatched. America's military forces, perhaps and despite all other propaganda, really have no equal. Our industry and our technology remain superior, Europe, China, and Japan notwithstanding. And because of our ideals and our principles, we wield a mighty and forceful hand in world affairs. There can be no doubt that the American flag is still respected by billions of the world's people as the symbol of freedom from tyranny. Every morning at the start of school, millions of kids still around the country pause to utter the words, "I pledge allegiance to the American flag and the United States of America," for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And yet, if Dr. King were here today, he might call into question the fact that that does not always still ring true. Because in many ways, we are still not yet one nation. That's the challenge. Far too many of our citizens do not see their existence as having been due to or under the direction of God. We're not yet indivisible, and nowhere in our own lifetime can it be said that we've practiced liberty and justice for all of our people. And so the genius that our founding fathers bequeathed to us was to have been, if realized, a form of government based on opportunity. But measured against the promise of America in many respects, we have still fallen short in ways that continue to haunt us, plague us, and unfortunately divide us. Have things changed for the better? Yes. Has there been real and measurable progress? Yes. But it is not just a matter of having come a long, long way. It is, in fact, a matter of having still yet a long, long way to go. And so as we begin the celebration of Dr. King's 96th birthday, let it serve, I hope, as a reminder of the union that he forged in the halls of Congress that assured the signage and the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act into law in 1965. Dr. King's spirit should and really must renew our resolve, particularly as members of Congress and as Americans of all walks of life, to stand for justice, fairness, and equal opportunity whenever and wherever possible. Across his life, Dr. King was awarded 5 honorary degrees, named Man of the Year by Time magazine, and at the age of 35 became the youngest man to have received the Nobel Peace Prize. But all of that didn't matter to him. All of the accolades and the other things that had been heaped upon him during his life, and I'm sure since his death, really would not stack up to mean very much in the heart and the soul of mind of Martin Luther King Jr. At 39 years of age, the person who led the nonviolent movement was taken from us in a cruel manner by the single bullet of a lone assassin. So it really didn't matter, as he said, as he preached his own eulogy, what people said. What mattered was that he tried to live his life to exemplify the dream that he had and that still burns. I can remember the numbness I felt on that evening of April 4th, 1968. Like so many others, I felt my heart race when I heard the words come over the radio that said, "Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is dead." And so when I reflect back on his life, as I am doing, and I appreciate so many of you who are watching are doing today, I am still reminded of a man who was unawed by opinion, unseduced by flattery, and undismayed by disaster. He confronted his life with the courage of his convictions, and then confronted his death with the courage of his faith. And so that is why, Mr. Speaker, I began by referencing that scripture in the book of Genesis, because Dr. Martin Luther King really was, and in the hearts of many of us, remains a dreamer. And so I will close by going back to that passage, 37th verse. And when they saw him from afar, even before he had come near to them, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, "Behold, the dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and we will cast him into some old pit, and we will say that some evil beast has devoured him, and we shall see what becomes of his dream." Just like that passage in Genesis, that dream has lived on. It lives in the hearts and the minds of so many of us. It is a dream that young people look at and try to fashion themselves after, and it is a dream that many of us who are much older will smile and go to our grave knowing that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in the truest sense a true American that gave all he could, not just for his dream, but for his country. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time that is remaining, and I thank you for this moment of indulgence.